My name is Vincent Rossi. I am 67 years old and a retired structural engineer. I spent 40 years of my life calculating the exact breaking point of concrete and steel. I know how to spot a hairline fracture in a foundation before the building collapses. But absolutely nothing prepared me for the structural failure of my own family. During Sunday dinner, my son-in-law Jared slid his phone under the mahogany table. The text on the bright screen glowing in the dim light read, "Dad, check your retirement account right now, then pretend you are having chest pains and leave." I opened my banking app, and the blood completely drained from my face. $440,000 had simply vanished. The balance was zero. I did exactly what he said. I clutched my chest and knocked over my wineglass. Jared rushed me out to his car, but as the doors locked, he did not start the engine. He looked at me with sheer terror and whispered a truth that left me entirely cold. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart the people who were supposed to love you the most. The dining room was suffocatingly warm. The clinking of expensive silverware against fine china echoed like a metronome ticking down to a disaster. Natalie sat at the head of the table. My daughter wore a pristine white blouse and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. She let out a sharp, forced laugh at a joke Cameron just told. My son sat across from me, swirling his expensive red wine with the arrogance of a man who believed the world owed him a favor. Cameron spent the last 20 minutes boasting about his latest logistics venture. He spoke in inflated corporate jargon about profit margins and aggressive expansion. I knew it was all a facade, a hollow structure waiting for the wind to knock it down. I sat quietly and chewed my roasted vegetables. I observed them the way I used to inspect a compromised bridge. The cracks were everywhere. Natalie constantly checked her reflection in the darkened window pane. She cared more about the appearance of this family dinner than the actual family sitting at the table. Cameron kept tapping his foot nervously against the floorboards, revealing the quiet desperation hiding beneath his tailored suit. I swallowed my food and let my gaze fall to the surface of the dining table. I built this mahogany table with my own two hands. It was my wedding gift to Natalie and Jared 7 years ago. I spent 3 months in my garage, sanding the raw wood, smoothing every rough edge, and applying coats of varnish until the surface reflected light like a calm lake. I put my sweat and my love into this piece of furniture, hoping it would be the foundation for decades of warm family memories. Looking at Natalie now, I realized a painful truth. The dead wood beneath my plate possessed far more warmth and integrity than the daughter sitting at the head of it. Jared sat to my left. My son-in-law was usually a vibrant conversationalist, but tonight he was a ghost. He pushed his food around his plate without taking a single bite. A thin layer of sweat coated his forehead. He avoided eye contact with everyone, especially his wife. I watched his breathing turn shallow and erratic. Jared was a good man. He worked as an accountant and always treated me with a quiet, genuine respect that my own children lacked. Seeing him trembling slightly in his chair put my senses on high alert. Suddenly, I felt a slight pressure against my thigh. Jared reached his hand under the thick mahogany table and pressed his cell phone against my leg. I lowered my left hand and took the device, keeping my movements entirely hidden by the oversized linen napkin resting on my lap. I glanced down. The screen brightness was turned to the lowest setting, but the text message typed into the Notes app was impossible to misinterpret. "Dad, check your retirement account right now. Then pretend you are having chest pains and leave." My heart slammed against my ribs. I did not gasp. I did not look at Jared. Decades of engineering taught me to remain absolutely stoic when facing a catastrophic failure. Panic is a useless emotion. Logic is the only tool that guarantees survival. I casually wiped my mouth with the napkin and reached into my slacks to retrieve my own phone. I kept it low near my waist, out of sight from Natalie and Cameron, who were now arguing loudly about the best neighborhoods to buy vacation homes. I opened my banking application. My fingers felt numb as I typed in my passcode. The loading circle spun for 3 agonizing seconds. The screen refreshed. The numbers materialized in bold black font. Available balance $0. A cold, violent shockwave ripped through my nervous system. $440,000. Gone. Evaporated into thin air. That money was not just a retirement fund. It was the life insurance payout from my late wife, Diane. It was the absolute last piece of her legacy designed to keep me safe in my final years. Cameron had begged me for a large piece of it 5 years ago to fund a reckless startup company. I refused to finance a venture doomed to fail. I told him he needed to learn the value of hard work. He stormed out of my house, calling me a selfish old man. Now, sitting at this dinner table, I realized this was their delayed revenge. They had bypassed my security and stripped me of everything. I stared at the 0 on the screen. The anger that ignited inside my chest was not a wild, uncontrollable flame. It was a cold, calculated furnace. They believed I was a fragile old man. They thought I was a vulnerable target they could exploit and discard without consequence. They were about to learn a brutal lesson in structural dynamics. Every action has an equal and opposite reaction. I locked my phone and slipped it back into my pocket. I needed an exit strategy. Jared had provided the perfect blueprint. I closed my eyes and focused on slowing my breathing. I let my shoulders slump forward. I brought my right hand up and gripped the center of my chest, tightly wrinkling the fabric of my button-down shirt. I let out a sharp, strained gasp. I leaned forward heavily, and my elbow collided with my wine glass. The crystal shattered against the mahogany wood. Deep red wine splashed across the table and dripped onto the expensive beige rug below. The dining room fell into absolute silence. Natalie jumped back from the table. Her primary reaction was not concern for her father. It was pure annoyance. She looked at the red stain spreading across her rug and let out a frustrated sigh. Cameron stared at me with wide eyes, completely paralyzed. Jared sprang into action immediately. He leaped out of his chair and grabbed my arm. His grip was firm and steady. "Vincent, are you okay?" he shouted, playing the role of the terrified son-in-law perfectly. "Your face is pale. We need to go right now." I gasped loudly and nodded, leaning my weight against his shoulder. I dragged my feet intentionally, making myself appear weak and uncoordinated. "Take him to the emergency room," Natalie ordered, waving her hand dismissively. She did not step forward to help. She grabbed a cloth from the kitchen and began dabbing at the spilled wine. "Keep me updated, Jared. I will stay here and clean up this mess." Cameron stood by the doorway, watching us leave with a cold, calculated gaze. He did not offer to drive. He did not offer to ride in the passenger seat. My own son watched me stumble out of the house, clutching my chest, and he simply crossed his arms over his chest. The indifference in his posture was the final piece of evidence I needed to understand their guilt. Jared practically carried me out the front door and down the paved driveway. The cool night air hit my face, but it did not calm the rage burning in my veins. Jared opened the passenger side door of his sedan and guided me inside. He ran around the hood, jumped into the driver's seat, and slammed the door shut. He immediately hit the central locking button. The heavy mechanical click echoed in the enclosed cabin. He did not put the key in the ignition. He did not start the engine. He gripped the leather steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned completely white. He turned to face me. His eyes were wide and filled with sheer terror. I dropped my hand from my chest and sat up straight. The performance was over. "Are we driving to the clinic?" I asked, my voice perfectly steady and dangerously low. Jared shook his head. He swallowed hard, struggling to find the breath to speak. "We are not going to the hospital, Vincent," he whispered, his voice trembling in the dark car. "I found the emails on Natalie's laptop an hour before you arrived. They did not just take your money tonight. They booked one-way flights. They are packing their bags and leaving the country in 48 hours. The tires of Jared's sedan screeched sharply as he whipped the steering wheel hard to the right. We veered off the main road and plunged into the sprawling asphalt wasteland of an abandoned strip mall. Faded yellow parking lines stretched out under the flickering glow of a single unbroken street lamp. Jared slammed the car into park. The engine idled with a low, steady hum. The silence inside the cabin felt heavier than reinforced concrete. I sat completely still in the passenger seat. My mind forcefully shifted from the fabricated chest pains to the cold, devastating reality of the numbers I had just seen on my phone screen. $440,000 vanished without a trace. My son-in-law gripped the leather steering wheel so tight, his knuckles shone white in the dim ambient light. He took a deep, shuddering breath and turned to face me. The sheer panic in his eyes told me everything I needed to know about the severity of our situation. Jared reached into his dark jacket pocket and pulled out a small silver flash drive. He held it out to me like a piece of unexploded ordnance. He explained with a trembling voice that he had cloned Natalie's hard drive 2 days ago. As an accountant, Jared naturally noticed subtle discrepancies in their joint household accounts. He found unexplained legal fees billed to a shady corporate attorney and intercepted late-night hushed phone calls between his wife and my son Cameron. Jared originally dug into her digital files looking for evidence of a romantic affair. Instead, he found a meticulously orchestrated conspiracy. I took the small metal drive from his shaking hand. Jared laid out the mechanics of their plot with clinical precision. Natalie and Cameron had not simply hacked a password or guessed a security question. They had engineered a complete legal bypass. They forged my signature on a comprehensive power of attorney document. They utilized a corrupt notary heavily connected to Cameron's failing business circle to illegally authenticate the paperwork. With that single fraudulent document, my children had walked into my financial institution and legally bypassed every security measure I had built over 40 years. They officially convinced the bank I was mentally declining and incapable of managing my own assets. I stared at the flash drive resting in my palm. The sheer audacity of the architecture behind their fraud was staggering. As a structural engineer, I spent my entire career identifying hidden stress points and calculating load distributions. My children had found the one stress point I never thought to reinforce: my absolute unwavering trust in my own blood. The missing money was not just a random collection of numbers sitting in a retirement fund. It was the physical manifestation of my late wife. That exact sum of $440,000 was the final life insurance payout after Diane lost her brutal battle with pancreatic cancer 10 years ago. It was the money she left behind to ensure I would never have to rely on anyone else in my old age. It was a sacred shield built on her sacrifice. 5 years ago, Cameron had come to my house demanding access to that exact account. He brought a flashy presentation for a new logistics startup company. He wanted me to act as his primary venture capitalist. I sat at my kitchen table and reviewed his business plan. It was built on hollow financial projections, cheap labor, and incredibly reckless profit margins. I told him absolutely no. I refused to sink Diane's final legacy into a vanity project designed merely to feed his massive ego. Cameron had thrown a heavy glass across my living room that night. It shattered against the brick fireplace. He screamed that I was a selfish, hoarding old man who wanted to see his own son fail. I thought his anger would eventually cool with time. I was entirely wrong. The resentment had simply festered, growing quietly in the dark until it infected Natalie as well. This theft was not a crime of sudden, desperate opportunity. It was a meticulously planned and long-delayed revenge. They felt completely entitled to Diane's money, and they decided my continued existence was merely an inconvenience delaying their inheritance. The suffocating silence of the parked car was violently shattered. Jared's phone began to vibrate loudly in the center cup holder. The bright screen illuminated the dark cabin. The caller identification displayed Natalie's name. Jared looked at me with pure panic flashing across his face. I raised my hand, signaling him to remain absolutely calm. I instructed him to answer the call and put the device on speakerphone immediately. I needed to hear the exact tone of my daughter's voice. Jared took a steadying breath, tapped the green button, and placed the phone on the center console. He forced his voice to sound breathless and frantic. He told his wife we were rushing to the nearest emergency room and that my chest pains were getting progressively worse. I waited for the natural response of a concerned daughter. I expected sudden panic or tears or desperate questions about my survival. Instead, Natalie's voice filtered through the small speaker with the chilling, businesslike authority. She did not ask if I was conscious. She did not ask if my heart was failing. She demanded to know the exact name of the hospital we were driving to. She told Jared to stop giving her useless, dramatic details and just send the address coordinates. Her next sentence froze the blood in my veins. She explicitly instructed Jared to inform the triage nurses the moment he arrived that I had been suffering from severe cognitive decline for the past 6 months. She stated she was driving over immediately and bringing the legal paperwork to assume total medical proxy. She told her husband she needed to speak directly with the attending physician about my rapidly deteriorating mental state before I could make any irrational decisions regarding my own medical care. The trap was now fully exposed in the open air. They were not just content with stripping my bank accounts bare. They were actively setting the stage to lock me inside a psychiatric ward. If they established a verified medical record of severe dementia tonight, I would lose all legal standing to challenge the massive theft of my funds tomorrow. The phone call ended with a sharp digital click. Jared stared at me as the horrifying reality of his wife's monstrous nature fully settled in his eyes. We were no longer dealing with greedy, disappointed children. We were dealing with absolute predators. The plan had swiftly escalated from financial ruin to total institutionalization. I looked out the windshield at the desolate parking lot. I had no money. I had no immediate legal authority over my own estate. But I had a fully functional, sharp mind, and they had deeply underestimated my capacity for retaliation. I told Jared to put the car in drive. We needed to find a hospital immediately, but definitely not the one my daughter was expecting us to walk into. The tires gripped the wet asphalt as Jared navigated the dark suburban streets. He avoided the main highway, taking back roads toward a specific urgent care clinic he knew on the edge of the county line. A massive emergency room at the city hospital would have involved aggressive interventions, endless questions, and a highly restrictive environment. We did not have time to be trapped in a bureaucratic medical maze. We needed a fast, undeniable paper trail to satisfy my daughter's sudden demand for proof, and we needed a secure place to operate. Jared pulled into the brightly lit parking lot of the 24-hour clinic. The harsh fluorescent lights cut through the darkness like sterile scalpels. Before opening the door, I took a long, deep breath and consciously shifted my entire physical demeanor. I let my shoulders sag. I made my hands tremble slightly. I needed to look like a man whose heart was failing, not a man whose mind was currently mapping out the absolute destruction of his own children. We walked through the sliding glass doors. Jared played his role with a terrifyingly convincing panic. He rushed to the front desk, his voice loud and frantic, demanding immediate attention for his father-in-law, who was experiencing severe chest pain and shortness of breath. The triage nurse took one look at my pale face and trembling hands and immediately wheeled me into an examination room in the back. The environment was cold and smelled strongly of antiseptic. A young doctor with tired eyes rushed in and began attaching adhesive electrodes to my chest and arms. The cold gel sent a sharp shiver down my spine. The heart monitor beside the bed began to beep with a steady, rhythmic pulse. The sound filled the small room, masking the quiet, urgent conversation Jared was having via text message near the doorway. The doctor asked me a series of standard questions about my pain levels, my diet, and my medical history. I answered him in a weak, breathless voice. I described a crushing sensation, a sudden, overwhelming wave of terror, and a tightness in my jaw. I did not have to lie very much. The physical symptoms of profound betrayal closely mimic the early stages of a cardiac event. The doctor studied the printout from the electrocardiogram. He let out a long breath and offered a reassuring smile. He explained that my heart was structurally sound. There were no blockages, no signs of an infarction. He diagnosed it as a severe acute panic attack, likely brought on by sudden stress. He prescribed a mild sedative and recommended I stay hooked up to the monitors for observation over the next 2 hours. He pulled the privacy curtain shut and left us alone in the sterile room. The moment the door clicked shut, the illusion of the frail old man vanished entirely. I sat up straight on the examination table and peeled the blood pressure cuff off my arm. I looked at my hands resting on the thin paper sheet covering the bed. My knuckles were swollen with arthritis. Deep scars crisscrossed my skin, permanent souvenirs from 40 years of grinding physical labor. As the heart monitor continued its steady, monotonous beep, the memories I had tried to bury began to flood my mind. I remembered the bitter, freezing winds howling off the suspension bridges I used to inspect. I remembered working consecutive double shifts, suspended hundreds of feet in the air, my joints screaming in agony. Every single drop of sweat, every hour of sleep I sacrificed, was channeled directly into a tuition fund for Cameron. I paid cash for his enrollment at one of the most prestigious and expensive business schools in the country. I wanted him to wear a suit. I wanted him to sit in a warm office far away from the dangerous, bone-crushing labor that defined my entire existence. My son repaid that ultimate sacrifice with a level of arrogance that still burns in my memory. Just 6 weeks before his final graduation ceremony, Cameron dropped out. He did not consult me. He did not apologize. He simply packed up his apartment and declared that a traditional business degree was entirely beneath his entrepreneurial genius. He claimed he was ready to conquer the financial world on his own terms. That decision cost me a fortune, but I swallowed my anger and continued to support him. I now realize my unconditional support was nothing more than an open invitation for him to destroy me. Jared interrupted my thoughts. He leaned against the closed door, staring at his phone. Natalie was relentlessly flooding his messages, demanding to speak to the attending physician. She wanted official confirmation of my cognitive decline. She was aggressively building her narrative while sitting comfortably in my dining room. We needed to escalate our own response immediately. I pulled my cell phone from my pocket and dialed a number I had not called in over 6 years. Lawrence Beck was a man composed entirely of sharp edges and cold logic. He was a forensic accountant who had transitioned into corporate law, specializing in hostile takeovers and asset recovery. During my years as a lead engineer, Lawrence was the man we called when a contractor tried to embezzle construction funds. He did not just find missing money, he absolutely ruined the people who took it. Lawrence answered on the second ring. His voice was gravelly, devoid of any pleasantries. I did not waste time with small talk. I outlined the situation with the same clinical detachment I would use to describe a collapsing steel beam. I told him about the forged power of attorney, the corrupt notary, and the $440,000 drained from my secure accounts. I told him my children were currently booking flights to leave the country in less than 2 days. Lawrence did not offer sympathy. He asked for the exact routing numbers, the account details, and the name of the notary. Jared read the information directly from the cloned flash drive he had plugged into his phone. Lawrence typed furiously on a mechanical keyboard in the background. The sound was like a machine gun firing in a distant room. He told me to stay exactly where I was and keep my phone close. He said he needed to make a few calls to federal banking contacts who owed him substantial favors. He hung up without saying goodbye. For the next 45 minutes, the examination room was a tomb of silence. Jared paced back and forth across the linoleum floor, occasionally typing out vague, evasive replies to Natalie to keep her from driving down to the clinic herself. I sat on the edge of the bed, watching the green line on the heart monitor spike and dip. I was actively calculating the precise amount of force required to shatter the lives of my son and daughter. Suddenly, my phone vibrated in my palm. The screen illuminated with Lawrence's name. I answered it immediately, bringing the device to my ear. Lawrence's voice was completely different this time. The gravelly tone was replaced by a sharp, predatory edge. He had accessed the digital trails utilizing back channels that only a man of his specific talents could navigate. He did not waste a single breath. "The money is not gone," Vincent Lawrence said, his words slicing through the sterile air of the clinic room. Cameron made a critical, arrogant mistake. He tried to move a massive sum of liquid cash across international borders without raising federal flags. To bypass the automatic security triggers, he routed the funds through a third-party shell corporation. I tightened my grip on the phone. Jared stopped pacing and stared at me, his eyes wide with anticipation. "The $440,000 has not left the country yet," Lawrence continued, his voice dropping an octave. "It is currently sitting completely frozen in a temporary holding account. But it is entirely automated. The system is scheduled to clear the funds and push them offshore at exactly midnight tonight." I looked up at the digital clock mounted on the clinic wall. It was currently 8:45 in the evening. We had exactly 3 hours and 15 minutes before my entire life savings evaporated into an untraceable ghost account overseas, funding the escape of the 2 people I brought into this world. The drive back to my house from the clinic was a masterclass in silent preparation. I needed a physical prop to sell my sudden medical decline. I instructed Jared to pull into the parking lot of a 24-hour pharmacy. He returned minutes later carrying a heavy wooden cane. When we finally turned into my familiar driveway, the facade had to be absolute. I stepped out of the passenger side of Jared's sedan, moving with a slow, deliberate stiffness. I leaned my entire weight heavily onto the wooden cane, letting my right hand tremble just enough to sell the illusion of a broken man. I was a retired structural engineer. I knew exactly how to construct a load-bearing lie. I pushed the heavy oak front door open. The atmosphere inside my own home felt entirely alien and deeply hostile. Natalie and Cameron were waiting in the center of the living room. The moment they saw my trembling frame, their faces contorted into masks of suffocating, exaggerated concern. Natalie rushed forward, cooing with a sickening sweetness I had not heard since she was a teenager trying to manipulate me for a new car. She cried out, claiming I had scared them to death. She wrapped her arms around my shoulders in a fragile, terrifying embrace. She guided me toward my favorite leather armchair, treating me as if my bones were made of spun glass. Cameron stood nearby, nodding with a solemn, grave expression that belonged in a poorly acted stage play. He told me to just sit back and relax. He proudly claimed they were going to take care of everything tonight. Taking care of everything apparently meant tearing my home apart. Under the guise of cleaning up the kitchen and making the environment safe for my recovery, my children began a systematic ransacking of my property. I sat deep in my leather armchair, keeping my breathing shallow and my eyes half closed. Through my eyelashes, I watched the vultures circle my life. Natalie opened various drawers in the hallway, tossing old mail and aggressively sorting through my private correspondence. She claimed she was merely looking for my medical insurance cards just in case I needed them later. I knew exactly what she was truly hunting for. Bank statements, financial records, passwords, anything that could give them a clearer picture of what remaining assets were left to steal. Cameron was even less subtle in his execution. He wandered into my home office just off the main living room. He left the heavy door slightly ajar, assuming I was far too exhausted and disoriented to notice his movements. The office was where I kept my heavy fireproof safe. It was the exact location where the physical deed to this house was locked away. I heard the unmistakable rustle of heavy paper and the sliding of metal filing cabinets. He was relentlessly searching for the deed. They were actively planning to sell my home right out from under my feet, and they needed the original paperwork to expedite their fraudulent transfer. I swallowed the bitter bile rising in the back of my throat. I sat silently and watched my own flesh and blood rifle through my life with the cold, ruthless detachment of a common burglar. When Cameron finally emerged from the home office, empty-handed, his frustration was palpable in the air. He paced the length of the living room. He began looking closely at the walls and the crown molding. He took his smartphone out of his pocket and opened a digital application. He stood directly in the center of the room and slowly rotated in a full circle. I realized with a sickening physical jolt that he was digitally measuring the dimensions of my living room. He was preparing the property for a fast real estate listing. He was literally mapping the square footage of my home for a cash sale, while I was sitting a few feet away, supposedly recovering from a severe cardiac event. I watched his expensive leather shoes step across the hardwood floors I had installed myself 30 years ago. Every step he took was a desecration of the life I built for him. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of his actions was staggering. Cameron pocketed his phone and let out a heavy, dramatic sigh meant for everyone in the room to hear. He began complaining loudly to Natalie about the crushing stress of his corporate liabilities. He whined about aggressive creditors and the heavy business debts currently suffocating his logistics company. He spoke as if his financial ruin was a tragic, unavoidable injustice inflicted upon him by a cruel, unforgiving world. I decided to test his absolute lack of empathy. I let out a weak, raspy cough, deliberately drawing their attention. I looked at Cameron with the tired, dull eyes of a dying man. I reminded him in a soft, shaking voice about the 2 separate, massive mortgages I had completely paid off for him when he was in his 20s. I gently recalled how I had emptied my personal savings accounts back then to save him from total bankruptcy when his very first business venture collapsed into ruin. Cameron looked down at me with pure, unadulterated arrogance. He waved his hand dismissively in the air, as if my monumental sacrifices were nothing more than ancient, irrelevant trivia. He scoffed loudly, adjusting the stiff cuffs of his tailored suit. He told me that was a very long time ago. He claimed the financial market was entirely different now, and that I simply did not understand how modern leverage and corporate debt truly worked. He turned his back on me instantly, dismissing the father who had bled and broken his own body to keep a solid roof over his head. The absolute lack of gratitude was a potent poison, but I welcomed it with open arms. His arrogance completely extinguished any lingering spark of paternal guilt I felt about my impending plan to destroy them. A few moments later, Natalie emerged from the kitchen, carrying a steaming porcelain mug on a small ceramic saucer. The sharp scent of strong herbal tea filled the living room, masking the subtle metallic smell of whatever chemical she had crushed into the boiling water. She wore a wide smile of pure maternal care that made the skin on the back of my neck crawl. She walked slowly toward my armchair, speaking in a soft, hypnotic voice. She murmured that she had brewed something special to help me sleep. She held the steaming cup out to me, insisting that I needed to rest my tired heart. She told me I needed a very long and very deep sleep to properly recover from the trauma of the evening. I reached out with a trembling hand, fully preparing to take the mug and pretend to drink it. From the corner of my right eye, I saw Jared stepping out of the dark kitchen hallway. His face was entirely pale. He locked eyes with me for a fraction of a second over his wife's shoulder. He subtly and urgently shook his head from side to side. He had seen something alarming on the granite kitchen counter while Natalie was brewing the tea. A strange residue, a fine white powdery substance hastily wiped away with a damp cloth, but not entirely concealed from a trained accountant accustomed to looking for missing details. Jared moved with lightning speed and unexpected authority. He stepped aggressively between Natalie and my leather armchair. He reached out and intercepted the porcelain mug just before my trembling fingers could touch the warm handle. He brought the rim to his lips, took a quick, deliberate sip, and immediately grimaced in exaggerated disgust. He firmly declared to the room that the tea was entirely too cold and far too bitter for a man with a highly sensitive stomach. He insisted with a loud, booming voice that he would brew a fresh hot pot himself to ensure my comfort. Natalie glared at her husband with a sudden flash of unfiltered murderous rage. Her perfectly crafted mask of the caring daughter slipped for a single terrifying second. As Jared turned his back and carried the tainted mug safely into the kitchen, the horrifying reality of their final endgame crystallized perfectly in my calculating mind. My children were not just waiting patiently for me to fade away into the background. They were actively attempting to chemically sedate me. She wanted to neutralize me. She needed me paralyzed in a deep chemical slumber so I would not wake up and notice the missing funds or the missing house deed until they were safely on an international flight. They wanted to erase my consciousness tonight, so they could finalize the absolute theft of my life tomorrow without facing a single ounce of resistance. The morning sunlight filtered through the kitchen blinds, casting long shadows across the hardwood floors. The house was entirely quiet, but it felt like a designated combat zone. Jared had slept on the living room sofa under the strict pretense of monitoring my fragile heart condition. The reality was that we needed a physical barrier between my bedroom and anyone who might try to finish the job they started with the tainted tea the night before. I stood by the kitchen counter, gripping the edge of the granite to ground myself. I spent the early hours practicing my physical performance. I needed my hands to shake naturally. I needed my posture to convey the hollow, vacant energy of a man whose mind was rapidly unraveling. The heavy front door swung open at exactly 9:00 o'clock. Natalie did not bother to knock. She marched into the entryway with a brisk, confident energy trailing a faint cloud of expensive floral perfume. A man followed closely behind her. Natalie guided him into the kitchen with a wide, professional smile. She introduced him as Greg, a highly recommended local roofing contractor. She claimed she brought him over to inspect a potential leak over the garage to ensure the property was perfectly maintained for my comfort. I looked at the man named Greg. I spent 4 decades on brutal construction sites and high-profile engineering projects. I know exactly what a roofing contractor looks like. A man who spends his life on hot asphalt shingles possesses calloused hands, sun-beaten skin, and a posture built on heavy physical labor. Greg had perfectly manicured fingernails, a crisp ironed polo shirt, and expensive loafers that had never touched a single drop of wet cement. He carried a sleek digital laser measure and a thick leather clipboard. He was not here to check the roof for water damage. He was a rogue real estate appraiser brought in to quietly evaluate my home for a rapid off-market cash sale. I shuffled toward the coffee maker, dragging my right foot slightly against the floorboards. I picked up a ceramic mug and a glass carafe. I intentionally let my wrist tremble, pouring the dark coffee so it splashed over the rim and pooled on the granite counter. Natalie watched me make the mess. She did not rush over to help. She simply crossed her arms and stared at me with a look of profound vindication. I turned to her, holding the dripping mug with both hands. I forced my eyes to look wide and unfocused. I asked her in a soft, hesitant voice if she was ready to go to Sunday Mass. I told her we needed to leave soon so her mother would not be angry with us for being late. It was a Tuesday morning. Her mother had been dead for 10 years. A sharp, predatory gleam flashed in Natalie's eyes. She turned to Greg, the appraiser, and let out a heavy, dramatic sigh. She gave him a look of deep, manufactured sorrow, completely validating the false narrative of my severe cognitive decline. She told me to just sit down and drink my coffee. She spoke to me using the slow, exaggerated tone one might use to command a confused toddler. I nodded obediently and shuffled over to the kitchen island, sinking heavily into a wooden stool. Greg did not ask a single question about the roof. He immediately began walking through the open concept living space, aiming his laser measure at the baseboards. The device emitted sharp electronic beeps as it calculated the exact square footage of the room. He walked into the kitchen and ran his soft hands over the granite countertops, checking the quality of the stone. He crouched down to inspect the brand of the stainless steel appliances. He was moving with urgent efficiency, cataloging every high-value asset attached to the property. Natalie leaned back against the kitchen island, standing less than 3 feet away from me. She began speaking to Greg at full volume, treating me as if I were entirely deaf or simply a mindless piece of furniture taking up space. She complained bitterly about the architecture of the house. She swept her hand through the air, calling the property a suffocating prison. She told Greg with a practiced, tragic sigh that she had suffered terribly growing up within these walls. She claimed she lived under the crushing weight of a tyrannical, strict father who never allowed her a single moment to breathe or enjoy her youth. I sat absolutely still, wrapping my hands around the warm coffee mug. I stared blankly at the wall, swallowing the sheer cruelty of her rewritten history. I listened to her paint me as a monster, while the truth burned silently in my chest. I remembered the reality of those teenage years perfectly. I remembered staying awake until 3 in the morning, waiting by the front window, with a knot of absolute terror in my stomach. I remembered driving through the worst neighborhoods in the city to pull her out of dark, smoke-filled basements. The social circle she chose to run with was deeply embedded in heavy narcotics. I became a tyrant because being a tyrant was the only way to keep her breathing. I enforced brutal curfews and locked the doors because the alternative was identifying her body in a morgue. 2 of her closest high school friends ended up either serving hard prison sentences or dying from chemical overdoses before they reached the age of 20. Diane was the soft touch who wiped her tears, but I was the heavy iron door that kept the wolves away from our home. She hated me for ruining her fun and destroying her social life. She never realized I sacrificed my relationship with her to save her life. I accepted the role of the villain back then, and sitting at this kitchen island, I accepted it again. Greg walked back into the kitchen, making rapid notes on his clipboard. He asked Natalie if the master bathroom retained the original vintage plumbing, or if it had been recently updated. Natalie eagerly offered to show him the master suite down the hall. Greg made a critical, arrogant mistake. He placed his heavy leather clipboard face down on the kitchen island, right next to my coffee mug. He followed Natalie out of the kitchen, leaving me completely alone with the documents. I did not move a single muscle. I did not break character. Jared stepped out of the shadow of the hallway, completely silent. He had been standing just out of sight, listening to the entire exchange. His face was a mask of cold, determined fury. He moved with absolute precision. He stepped up to the kitchen island and pulled his smartphone from his pocket. With his free hand, he carefully lifted the cover of the leather clipboard. I kept my eyes fixed on the wall, acting as the perfect lookout. Jared hovered his phone over the appraisal documents. I heard the faint, rapid clicking of his digital camera shutter. He took 3 clear photographs capturing the property valuation, the targeted closing date, and the specific details of the private buyer. He gently lowered the cover back into place and slipped the phone deep into his pocket. He melted back into the hallway shadows just seconds before Natalie and Greg returned to the kitchen. Greg picked up his clipboard, thanked Natalie for her time, and promised to have the final numbers submitted by the end of the business day. Natalie walked him to the front door, her voice bubbling with victorious energy. 10 minutes later, Jared and I stood together in the cold, dim light of my garage. We were completely insulated from the house and any hidden listening devices. Jared pulled out his phone and opened the photo gallery. He zoomed in on the high-resolution image of the appraisal contract. The documents detailed a rapid 48-hour closing schedule. The buyer was not a family moving into the neighborhood. It was listed as a private holding company, a sterile corporate entity hidden behind a generic acronym. Jared stared at the address Drems listed for the buyer. His eyes narrowed as his accounting background kicked into overdrive. He looked up at me, his jaw clenched tight. He recognized the corporate address immediately. It was not a random real estate firm. The address belonged to a specific commercial suite in a downtown high-rise. It was the exact same registered address as Cameron's failing logistics company. The sheer scale of their combined treachery locked into place with terrifying clarity. Natalie was not just selling my house to a random stranger to split the cash. She was bypassing the open real estate market entirely to liquidate my physical assets directly into Cameron's fraudulent corporate network. They were working in perfect, devastating unison. Cameron had drained the massive cash reserves, and Natalie was feeding the physical property into his shell companies to hide the assets from any future legal scrutiny. They were burning my entire legacy to the ground and using the ashes to heat their own empty lives. I looked at the photograph on the screen, and I felt a profound sense of absolute clarity. The time for gathering evidence was over. It was time to initiate the structural collapse of their entire world. The neon sign outside the diner flickered with a dull red glow, casting long, distorted shadows across our booth. The air inside smelled of stale coffee and fried grease. It was the perfect place for a covert meeting. Nobody looking for a multi-million-dollar corporate attorney would ever step foot inside this particular diner. Lawrence Beck sat across from Jared and me. Lawrence had not changed a bit since our days working on massive city infrastructure projects. He wore a sharp charcoal suit that looked entirely out of place against the cracked vinyl of the booth. He opened his sleek silver laptop and turned the screen toward us. The digital paper trail was laid out with absolute clinical precision. Lawrence did not waste time with pleasantries. He pointed to a series of highlighted transactions. He explained that Cameron had not just moved the $440,000 into a standard savings account. My son had funneled the money through a labyrinth of temporary holding accounts, trying to wash the funds before they reached their final destination. But Lawrence was a predator in the financial world. He tracked the digital footprints directly to a corporate shell entity registered in Delaware. The primary beneficiary of that shadow corporation was Cameron. My own son was treating my life savings like a corporate acquisition. Jared leaned forward, gripping his ceramic coffee mug so tightly his knuckles turned white. He asked Lawrence how they could possibly move the money if the primary account required two-factor authentication. Lawrence clicked a button on his keyboard, bringing up a scanned document. It was the comprehensive power of attorney. Lawrence explained that this document gave Cameron and Natalie total unchecked authority over my estate. They had legally bypassed the bank security by presenting themselves as my emergency financial guardians. Lawrence closed the laptop slightly and looked directly into my eyes. His gaze was heavy and scrutinizing. He asked me a question that hung in the stale diner air like a physical weight. He wanted to know if I was truly prepared for the fallout. He reminded me that initiating a federal fraud freeze was not a warning shot. It was a declaration of total war. He leaned across the sticky table and asked if I had the emotional stomach to completely destroy my own flesh and blood. He warned me that once he filed the paperwork, Cameron would face severe criminal charges. There would be no quiet family reconciliation. I did not raise my voice. I did not shed a single tear. I brought my clenched fist down hard against the cheap laminate table. The silverware rattled against the porcelain plates. I looked Lawrence dead in the eye and told him exactly who I was. I reminded him of the time the city brought us in to evaluate the structural integrity of the old downtown suspension bridge. The steel cables were corroding from the inside out. The city council wanted to patch it up with cheap cosmetic repairs to save public face. I refused. I ordered the complete demolition of that bridge because leaving a rotten foundation intact guarantees a catastrophic collapse and massive casualties. I told Lawrence my family was that rotting bridge. The foundation had completely failed. Natalie and Cameron were no longer my children. They were parasites actively tearing down the load-bearing walls of my life. I was not a fragile elderly victim waiting to be put in a nursing home. I was a structural engineer diagnosing a fatal flaw. I ordered Lawrence to tear the building down. So, a slow, cold smile spread across Lawrence's face. He opened his laptop fully, and his fingers flew across the keyboard with lethal speed. He bypassed the standard banking procedures and utilized a direct channel to a federal financial regulatory agency. He did not file a simple dispute. He filed a silent freeze on the Delaware Shell Company, citing imminent and highly coordinated wire fraud. By utilizing his specific legal credentials, he bypassed the forged power of attorney entirely. The freeze was executed as a stealth maneuver. Cameron and Natalie would receive absolutely no email notifications. They would receive no phone calls from the bank. The money would simply sit in the holding account locked in a federal vault until Cameron attempted to access it. And when he did, the trap would snap shut on his fingers. Lawrence hit the enter key with a definitive strike. He announced that the $440,000 was successfully secured. The federal block was active. I let out a long, slow breath, feeling a massive weight lift from my chest. Jared slumped back against the vinyl booth, running a hand through his hair. We had neutralized their primary weapon. We had cut off their escape funding. but the relief lasted exactly 10 seconds. Lawrence's eyes narrowed as he stared at his computer screen. The glow of the monitor reflected off his glasses. He began typing again, pulling up a different database. He told us to wait. He accessed the county property registry, scrolling through a list of pending transactions. The atmosphere in the diner suddenly grew suffocatingly dense. Lawrence turned the screen back toward us. He pointed to a new document that had just been uploaded to the county system earlier that afternoon. My heart slammed against my ribs. It was a real estate listing. But it was not a standard public listing. It was a closed-off market cash transaction. Natalie had taken the digital measurements Cameron made in my living room and pushed them to a private investment group. Lawrence looked at me with a grim expression. He explained that freezing the bank account was only half the battle. Natalie had leveraged the forged power of attorney to fast-track the sale of my physical home. She found a cash buyer willing to bypass standard inspections for a severely discounted price. Lawrence tapped the screen, highlighting the closing date at the bottom of the legal contract. Natalie had scheduled the final signature transfer. They were selling my house right out from under me, and the transaction was scheduled to close in exactly 48 hours. The morning after our covert diner meeting, the atmosphere inside my own home felt like a pressurized cabin, moments before a catastrophic breach. I woke up precisely at 6 to find my mahogany nightstand entirely bare. The gold-rimmed reading glasses I had kept in that exact spot bought for over 20 years were gone. The small amber bottle containing my daily blood pressure medication had also completely vanished. Natalie was initiating the next phase of her psychological warfare. She was actively trying to manufacture a medical crisis. She wanted me to wake up disoriented. She expected me to tear the bedroom apart, tossing blankets and pillows onto the floor, screaming about my missing pills like a frantic, unhinged old man. She needed me to perform the role of a terrified dementia patient to justify the legal trap she was currently building. I sat on the edge of the mattress and simply smoothed the wrinkles out of my cotton sheets. I did not panic. I did not raise my voice. Panic is the enemy of structural integrity. Jared had already anticipated this exact sabotage. During our drive back from the diner, he handed me a concealed backup supply of my vital medications, along with a spare pair of reading glasses. He also spent 3 hours in the middle of the night, quietly wiring a high-definition micro-lens directly into the digital clock resting on my living room mantel. It was connected to a secure cloud server completely untouchable by my children. Every square inch of the main living space was now a pristine recording studio waiting to document their crimes. I walked into the kitchen wearing my bathrobe perfectly composed. Natalie was leaning against the granite island sipping a cup of dark coffee. She watched me with sharp, predatory eyes waiting for the inevitable meltdown. She asked me in a sickly sweet voice if I had slept well and if I needed help finding anything this morning. The condescension in her tone was thick enough to choke on. I walked calmly to the refrigerator, poured myself a glass of cold water, and drank it slowly. I turned to my daughter and offered her a polite, empty smile. I told her I slept beautifully and needed absolutely nothing. The profound disappointment that washed over her face was deeply satisfying. My absolute calm disrupted her entire calculated narrative. When a manipulator fails to get the emotional explosion they desire, they naturally escalate their tactics. Over the next 4 hours, Natalie turned my home into a theater of the absurd. She began deliberately displacing household objects. I walked into the kitchen to find the television remote sitting inside the refrigerator next to the milk. I found a bundle of my private mail tossed carelessly into the oven. She was planting physical evidence of severe cognitive decay, trying to create a manufactured reality where I was a danger to myself. She paced around the living room talking loudly on her cell phone to Cameron. She made absolutely sure her voice carried down the hallway. She cried dramatic fake tears, telling her brother that I was completely losing my grip on reality. She claimed I was putting things in the oven and wandering around the house with a blank, vacant stare. She narrated a detailed, horrifying story of my mental collapse directly into the hidden camera Jared had installed on the mantel. She was literally handing me the psychological abuse evidence on a silver platter. I sat quietly in my leather armchair reading a newspaper without my glasses, pretending to stare blankly at the blurry print. Natalie ended her phone call and marched directly over to my chair. Her frustration was boiling over into raw, visible anger. She stood over me, crossing her arms, demanding to know why I was just sitting there, completely unresponsive to the world around me. She threw her hands in the air and called me a lifeless statue. She sneered that I was entirely incapable of feeling any real human emotion. She told me I had always been a cold, empty shell of a man, and that my current mental decline was just a reflection of my hollow personality. Her cruel words were specifically designed to break my spirit and provoke a screaming match. I simply looked up at her, maintaining a terrifyingly blank expression. I let the silence stretch out between us, refusing to give her the fuel she desperately craved. Her insult did not hurt me. It simply reminded me of the unvarnished truth. When her mother Diane was diagnosed with terminal pancreatic cancer, the foundation of this entire family crumbled overnight. Natalie had completely fallen apart. She locked herself in her childhood bedroom, crying for weeks and refusing to face the reality of her mother's dying body. Cameron was just as useless. He drank himself into a heavy blind stupor every single night, unable to cope with the impending loss. They both abandoned their mother when she needed them the most. I was the only one who remained standing. I organized the complicated hospice care. I managed the mountain of medical bills. I bathed my dying wife. I fed her when she was too weak to lift a spoon, and I held her fragile hand while she took her final labored breaths. My emotional stoicism was not a defect. It was the only structural support that kept our family from completely caving in on itself during the darkest year of our lives. I sacrificed my own right to grieve so my children could fall apart safely. And now my daughter was taking that exact same stoic strength and using it as a weapon to brand me as a sociopath. She wanted to use my quiet resilience as proof of a rotting brain. I swallowed the deep, burning pain in my chest and continued to play the fool. I offered her a slow, confused blink and turned my attention back to the blurry newspaper. Natalie let out a loud, dramatic groan of disgust and stomped away toward the kitchen. She believed she had won the morning battle. She thought my silence was proof that her psychological warfare was effectively wearing down my cognitive defenses. She did not realize she was performing a masterclass in elder abuse for an audience of forensic attorneys. The heavy chime of the front doorbell shattered the tense afternoon silence. Natalie rushed to open the heavy wooden door with an eagerness that immediately put my senses on high alert. Cameron stepped into the bright foyer wearing a sharp, tailored suit. His face carried that same manufactured mask of deep, suffocating concern. But he was not alone. Following closely behind my son was a younger man dressed in a crisp gray suit carrying a thick leather briefcase. Cameron guided the stranger into the living room, placing a firm, guiding hand on the man's shoulder. Cameron looked down at me sitting in my armchair and offered a wide, reassuring smile. He spoke in a soft, condescending voice, claiming he had brought a friendly doctor over to the house just to do a routine checkup on my heart after my terrifying panic attack at the dinner table. I looked at the man holding the leather briefcase. I noticed the complete lack of a medical bag or a stethoscope. I saw the sharp, calculating intelligence in his eyes. He was not a cardiologist. He was not here to check my blood pressure or listen to my lungs. I knew exactly what this was. Cameron had brought the executioner directly into my living room. This man was a bribed psychiatrist hired to conduct a rigged preliminary evaluation. They needed a signature on a medical document certifying my severe dementia to finalize the theft of my entire estate. The final trap had arrived right at my front door. The young man carrying the leather briefcase stepped entirely into the living room. Cameron placed a heavy hand on his shoulder, presenting him as a trusted medical professional making a casual house call. The man introduced himself as Dr. Evans. His voice was smooth and practiced, layered with an artificial warmth designed to pacify the elderly. He did not wear a white coat or carry a stethoscope. He wore a tailored charcoal suit and a luxury watch that cost more than a standard nurse's annual salary. He sat down on the edge of the velvet sofa directly across from my leather armchair. He placed his briefcase on the glass coffee table and clicked the brass latches open. Natalie hovered near the hallway archway, watching the scene unfold with barely contained anticipation. She had already set the stage by claiming I was disoriented and wandering the house. Dr. Evans pulled a thick stack of printed forms from his briefcase along with a silver fountain pen. These were the preliminary psychiatric evaluation documents. A single signature from this bribed professional would grant Cameron the legal leverage he needed to seize total control of my life and force me into a locked medical facility. The doctor leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. He looked into my eyes with a patronizing tilt of his head. He asked me how I was feeling today, speaking slowly and loudly, as if communicating with a frightened child. I kept my hands resting loosely on the armrests of my chair. I let my jaw hang slightly slack, maintaining the illusion of a foggy, deteriorating mind. Dr. Evans offered a sympathetic smile to Cameron before turning his attention back to me. He began the standard cognitive assessment. He asked me to tell him my full name and my current address. He asked me to identify the current day of the week, the month, and the year. He pulled a blank sheet of white paper from his stack and slid it across the glass table toward me. He asked me to draw the face of a clock and place the hands at exactly 10 minutes past 11. It was a humiliating elementary exercise designed to document the supposed collapse of my neural pathways. Cameron crossed his arms over his chest, radiating a smug, victorious energy. He truly believed he had outsmarted me. He believed I was just a tired, broken old man ready to be discarded into a sterile white room. I looked at the blank piece of paper and the silver pen. I did not reach for them. I let a heavy, suffocating silence fill the living room. The quiet stretched on for 10 agonizing seconds. Natalie shifted her weight nervously, adjusting her posture in the hallway. Dr. Evans gently tapped the paper, urging me to try my best. He assured me that there were no wrong answers and that we were just having a friendly conversation. The performance was officially over. I sat up straight in my leather armchair. I rolled my shoulders back instantly, dropping the frail, trembling posture I had maintained all morning. I looked directly into the eyes of Dr. Evans, and I did not blink. The sudden transformation in my physical demeanor hit the room like a sudden drop in barometric pressure. The patronizing smile on the doctor's face faltered slightly. I began speaking in a voice that was crystal clear, sharp, and entirely devoid of hesitation. I stated my full legal name, my date of birth, and my exact social security number. I recited the precise latitude and longitude coordinates of the property we were currently sitting in. I told him it was Tuesday, June 30th, 2026. I informed him that the current time was exactly 12 minutes and 14 seconds past 3 in the afternoon. I explained that the lunar cycle was currently in a waning crescent phase. I did not stop there. I looked at the glass coffee table separating us. I told him the exact tensile strength and weight-bearing capacity of the tempered glass top. I effortlessly rattled off the complex mathematical equations used to calculate the structural load distribution of the hardwood floor beneath his expensive leather shoes. Dr. Evans stared at me, completely paralyzed. His hand hovered frozen over his clipboard. The confident, arrogant aura he had carried into my home evaporated into thin air. He looked nervously toward Cameron, seeking some kind of explanation for the sudden aggressive lucidity of his supposed dementia patient. Cameron was rigid, staring at me with his mouth slightly open. The shock of my sudden recovery was short-circuiting his brain. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on my knees, mirroring the doctor's earlier posture. I lowered my voice to a cold, conversational register. I told Dr. Evans that I knew exactly where his private medical practice was located. I recited the specific street address of his clinic, located in the upscale financial district of the city. I noticed a visible tremor in his fingers as I continued speaking. I told him that I was intimately familiar with that particular commercial building. 22 years ago, my engineering firm was contracted to evaluate the adjacent parking structure. I began to dissect the architectural flaws of his clinic with surgical precision. I described the exact composition of the foundational concrete. I explained how the western wall of his building was improperly reinforced during the initial construction phase. I detailed the microfractures currently spreading through the subterranean masonry directly beneath his plush corner office. I told him that the structural integrity of his clinic was compromised by a minor geological settling issue that the original contractors had deliberately ignored to save money. I spoke with the absolute undeniable authority of a master structural engineer. I proved beyond a shadow of a doubt that my mind was a steel trap cataloging decades of highly technical information with flawless recall. The color completely drained from the doctor's face. He realized he had walked into a devastating ambush. But I was not finished dismantling him. I took a slow, deep breath and delivered the final fatal blow. I recited his full medical license number digit by digit without looking at a single piece of paper. I mentioned the specific state medical disciplinary board that governs his practice. I casually dropped the name Lawrence Beck into the conversation. I told the doctor that Lawrence was currently auditing a specific shell corporation in Delaware, and that he was very interested in the sudden cash deposits made into the doctor's personal accounts over the past 48 hours. The mention of Lawrence's name and the implication of a federal financial audit shattered the doctor completely. He realized his entire career, his freedom, and his medical license were currently hanging by a thread. He was no longer dealing with a helpless old man. He was sitting across from a highly coordinated forensic counterattack. He stood up so fast his knees knocked against the heavy glass coffee table. He practically threw the blank cognitive evaluation forms back into his leather briefcase. His hands were shaking violently as he snapped the brass latches shut. Cameron stepped forward, holding his hands out in a desperate attempt to salvage his crumbling scheme. He demanded to know what the doctor was doing. He ordered him to sit back down and finish the evaluation. He insisted that my sudden aggressive outburst was actually a classic textbook symptom of advanced paranoid dementia. He begged the doctor to just sign the preliminary paperwork so they could proceed with the medical commitment. Dr. Evans did not even look at my son. He grabbed the handle of his briefcase and backed away toward the front door, as if the living room floor was covered in venomous snakes. He told Cameron in a high panicked voice that he was completely withdrawing from the case. He stated categorically that there was absolutely nothing wrong with my cognitive functions. He refused to put his signature on any document and warned Cameron never to contact his office again. He turned and practically sprinted out of the front door, letting it slam shut behind him. The silence that descended on the living room was deafening. The grand master plan to lock me away in a medical prison had just burned to ashes in less than 5 minutes. Cameron stood frozen in the center of the room, staring at the closed front door. His chest heaved with heavy, erratic breaths. The panic and realization of his total failure morphed instantly into unhinged, explosive rage. He turned slowly to face me. The mask of the caring son was completely gone, replaced by the face of a desperate, cornered animal. He lunged across the distance separating us. He reached down and violently grabbed my right arm, his fingers digging painfully into my bicep. He yanked me forward, preparing to scream in my face, preparing to use physical intimidation to force my compliance. He was entirely unhinged, completely unbothered by the fact that he was assaulting his own father. Before Cameron could drag me out of my chair, a massive force collided with his chest. Jared had moved from the kitchen archway with the speed of a freight train. He slammed both of his hands squarely into Cameron's shoulders. Jared shoved my son backward with incredible physical power. Cameron stumbled wildly over the edge of the living room rug, losing his balance and crashing hard into the wall near the hallway. Jared stood directly between me and Cameron. He widened his stance, planting his feet firmly on the hardwood floor. He did not say a word, but his physical presence was a lethal warning. He was a quiet accountant by trade, but in that moment, He was a massive, immovable shield. He stared Cameron down, daring him to take another step forward. The illusion of family civility was completely dead. The polite warfare was over. We were now standing in the wreckage of our bloodline, waiting to see who would survive the final collapse. The confrontation with the corrupt psychiatrist left the house steeped in a toxic, suffocating silence. Cameron had stormed out immediately after Jared shoved him, dragging Natalie closely behind him. I fully expected them to retreat and regroup after such a spectacular failure. I severely underestimated their sheer, unadulterated desperation. The rapidly approaching deadline for their private cash sale must have been pressing down on them like a physical weight. They could not afford to wait for another fake medical evaluation. They needed my signature immediately, and they were willing to abandon all subtlety to get it. The very next evening, the heavy oak front door swung open without a single knock. Natalie and Cameron invited themselves over for dinner, carrying greasy bags of takeout food as a pathetic, transparent olive branch. They marched into my home pretending the violent altercation from the previous afternoon had simply never happened. But they did not come alone. A third person stepped timidly into my brightly lit foyer. He was a short, heavily sweating man wearing a cheap polyester suit that fit him poorly. He clutched a worn leather briefcase tightly against his chest like a protective shield. Cameron introduced him as Arthur, claiming he was a close personal friend and a certified public notary who had kindly agreed to join us for a family meal. I looked at the man named Arthur. He smelled faintly of stale tobacco and nervous perspiration. He actively avoided making eye contact with me, staring intently at the hardwood floor instead. This was not a friendly dinner guest. This was a hired mercenary brought into my home to rubber stamp the absolute theft of my entire life. I offered him a polite, empty smile and slowly shuffled toward the dining room, leaning heavily on my wooden cane. We sat around the large mahogany dining table. The expensive takeout food remained inside the cardboard containers, completely untouched. The air in the room was incredibly thick and heavy. It felt exactly like the atmosphere right before a massive, violent thunderstorm. Natalie took the lead with a sickeningly sweet tone that made my skin crawl. She reached across the table and unlatched Arthur's leather briefcase. She pulled out a thick, heavy stack of legal documents and slid them across the polished wood until they rested directly in front of my plate. Natalie spoke in a voice dripping with manufactured maternal care. She told me these were standard medical proxy forms. She claimed the hospital required them to be updated on file after my terrifying cardiac event and the highly stressful psychiatric evaluation. She smiled warmly, placing her hand softly over mine. She said it was just a simple formality to ensure that she and Cameron could quickly make emergency medical decisions for me if my health suddenly deteriorated. She gently patted my knuckles, telling me not to worry my tired mind over the boring fine print. I did not pull my hand away from her toxic grip. I moved slowly and deliberately. I reached into my shirt pocket and retrieved the spare reading glasses Jared had provided for me. I slid the wireframes onto my face and looked down at the dense black text. The documents were meticulously crafted. They were packed entirely with complex, convoluted legal jargon specifically designed to confuse and overwhelm an ordinary elderly layman. But I was not an ordinary layman. I was a structural engineer who had spent 40 years scrutinizing thousands of pages of municipal zoning contracts and massive material liability waivers. My eyes sliced through the deceptive formatting and locked immediately onto the core operational clauses. These were not medical proxy forms. There was absolutely no mention of healthcare directives, hospitals, or emergency medical power. It was a complete and irrevocable transfer of physical property. The documents explicitly signed over the deed of my home directly into the specific Delaware Shell Corporation that Lawrence Beck had identified the night before. They were attempting to finalize the theft right in front of my face, sitting at the very table where I had fed them as children. I placed both of my hands flat on the mahogany table. The silence in the dining room stretched incredibly tight. I looked directly across the table at Cameron. I slowly slid the thick stack of papers back across the polished surface until the edges bumped against his pristine white shirt cuffs. I kept my voice incredibly low and terrifyingly calm. I instructed my son to read the third paragraph on the second page aloud so everyone in the room could hear the medical directives. Cameron blinked rapidly. His confident, arrogant posture faltered instantly. He looked nervously at Natalie and then down at the dense text. He let out a breathless, nervous laugh, waving his hand dismissively in the air. He tried to brush my request aside, claiming it was just standard legal boilerplate language. He lied effortlessly, stating the clause was simply designed to protect my assets, so the government would not seize my house if I ever needed long-term assisted living care. He was spinning a chaotic web of financial buzzwords, trying to drown the glaring truth in absolute nonsense. I did not let him finish his pathetic cowardice. I raised my right hand and slammed my open palm down hard against the heavy oak table. The loud, violent crack echoed through the dining room like a gunshot. Arthur, the corrupt notary, physically jumped out of his chair, dropping his pen onto the floor. Natalie gasped loudly, shrinking back against her seat. I dropped the frail, trembling old man act entirely. I sat up straight, expanding my chest, and letting the decades of commanding chaotic construction sites fill my physical posture. I locked eyes with my son, and the temperature in the room plummeted. I told him I did not ask for a vague summary. I demanded that he read the exact words printed on the page. I told him he was sitting in the house that I built with my own 2 hands. I told him he was sitting at the table I bought with the sweat of my own back. I demanded absolute total respect under my own roof. I leaned forward, keeping my eyes locked on his pale face. I reminded Cameron of his high school years. I vividly recalled the times he would try to forge my signature on his failing report cards. He used to wait until I came home exhausted from working double shifts, thinking I was too tired and broken to notice his sloppy, panicked handwriting. I told him he was still that exact same foolish, arrogant little boy trying to pull a cheap trick on a man who saw straight through his lies. I told him I spent my entire life reading the fine print to keep this family from collapsing into ruin, and I was certainly not going to stop reading the fine print tonight. Cameron turned completely white. His jaw clenched in furious, impotent rage. He realized in that terrible moment that I was perfectly lucid. He realized I knew exactly what the document truly was. The tension in the dining room was absolute and suffocating. Jared was standing silently near the kitchen archway, with his muscles tensed and ready to physically intervene if Cameron decided to lash out violently again. Arthur, the notary, looked absolutely terrified. He clutched his official legal stamp against his chest like a protective shield, glancing desperately toward the front door. I let the heavy silence hang over the table for 10 agonizing seconds. I stared my son down until he physically looked away, completely unable to hold my gaze. I had proved my point. I had broken him in his own arrogant trap. But then I let out a long, slow breath. I consciously allowed my rigid shoulders to sag forward. I let my hands develop that slight, barely noticeable tremor once again. I reached across the table and slowly pulled the stack of papers back toward my chest. I looked at Natalie with dull, tired, defeated eyes. I told them that I was just so incredibly exhausted. I told them my heart was pounding, and I simply did not want to fight with my own children anymore. I reached out and picked up the heavy silver pen Arthur had left near the edge of the documents. I slowly signed my full legal name on the dotted line at the bottom of the final page. I pushed the signed papers toward the sweating notary. Arthur hastily stamped the pages, his hands shaking violently. He packed the documents into his briefcase, desperate to finalize the corrupt transaction and escape my home. Natalie and Cameron exchanged a rapid, silent look across the dining room table. It was a look of pure, unadulterated victory. Their previous panic had completely vanished, replaced by the smug realization that they had finally won. They truly believed they had successfully bullied and manipulated a tired, confused old man into surrendering his greatest remaining asset. They smiled at each other, completely unaware that by forcing me to sign that specific document in front of a fraudulent notary, They had just handed Lawrence Beck the final definitive piece of criminal evidence he needed to detonate their entire lives. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind Natalie and Cameron, and the house felt instantly lighter, as if a foul miasma had been purged from the rooms. I sat at the mahogany table for a long moment, listening to the receding sound of their footsteps on the driveway. I needed to ensure they were truly gone. I pulled my cell phone from my robe pocket and dialed Lawrence Beck. He picked up on the first ring, his voice sharp and alert. I told him the deed transfer was signed and sealed and on its way to the county clerk's office. I heard the audible click of his keyboard as he prepared to monitor the incoming data packets. I leaned back in my chair, feeling a profound sense of satisfaction. I revealed to Lawrence the final stroke of my counterattack. I had signed the deed transfer not with my legal name, but with a specific alias I had utilized for a classified deep-cover government contract in the 1980s. It was a signature profile that no longer officially existed in any civilian database. The alias was legally voided the moment the contract ended. By signing the document with a non-existent identity, I had effectively created a massive legal landmine. As soon as the county clerk attempted to register that deed against the property title, the system would trigger a mandatory identity verification mismatch. The software would cross-reference the signature with my actual social security number and legal identity. The resulting conflict would immediately flag the transaction as a high-priority case of identity fraud and attempted property theft. It would not just void the sale. It would initiate an automatic criminal investigation by federal regulators. My children thought they were stealing a house. They were actually handing the federal government a roadmap of their entire criminal enterprise. I walked to the window, watching the moonlight spill across the garden. I spoke to Jared, who stood in the kitchen doorway. I told him about the origin of the alias. My late wife Diane was the only person on this earth who knew about that secondary identity. She had been the one who insisted I maintain it, even after I retired from government service. She told me repeatedly that my meticulous nature and my penchant for redundant security would eventually save my life. I had laughed at her warnings back then, dismissing them as unnecessary caution. Tonight, those warnings were the structural columns supporting my entire plan. Diane had been right once again. Her wisdom was the silent partner in this war. Lawrence Beck remained on the line, his silence heavy with unspoken admiration. He confirmed he was watching the real estate portal, waiting for the inevitable rejection notice. He told me the trap was perfectly set. Every move Natalie and Cameron made now would only drive them deeper into the federal investigation. They were running through a burning building while locking all the exits from the inside. Suddenly, Lawrence's tone shifted into something harder and more urgent. He told me to stay focused because the stakes had just increased again. He had been monitoring the secondary transaction flow in the background of Cameron's Shell Corporation account. The software alerted him to a massive outbound attempt. Cameron had tried to force a transfer of the frozen $440,000 to an untraceable offshore account. He was desperate and completely ignorant of the fact that the federal government already held the keys to his digital safe. The transfer attempt was automatically rejected by the banking firewall, but the system triggered a mandatory lockdown of every account associated with Cameron's corporate tax ID. The lockdown was total. It was not just a freeze anymore. It was a complete institutional blacklisting. Cameron would not be able to send a wire, pay a vendor, or even access his own personal ATM card. The $440,000 was permanently entombed. I looked at Jared, who stood in the living room, his face glowing in the light of his phone screen. He gave me a sharp nod. We had successfully executed the freeze. Cameron was now stranded in the middle of a massive financial collapse with no liquid assets and a federal investigation breathing down his neck. The trap had closed on their fingers as cleanly as a guillotine blade. I walked slowly back toward my armchair, feeling the weight of the last few days finally beginning to dissipate. I realized I was not just dismantling a petty theft. I was purging a rot that had been growing in my family for over 20 years. I had watched them transform from children into architects of their own destruction. It was not the ending I had ever wanted for them, but it was the ending they had authored themselves. I looked around the room, feeling the familiar comfort of my home. My home was still mine. My life was still mine. I looked at the digital clock on the mantel, where the hidden lens was still active, still capturing the final echoes of their arrogance. I was ready for whatever came next. I was ready for the inevitable moment when they finally realized the ground they were standing on had already vanished beneath them. I felt no pity, only the cold, detached resolve of an engineer who had finally neutralized a structural catastrophe. The bridge would stand. I was the one who held the blueprints now. Every structure in this world has a breaking point. I spent my entire professional life calculating the exact amount of physical stress a foundation could endure before it cracked and gave way. A business is absolutely no different. It is constructed on a foundation of capital and ethics and human labor. My son Cameron had built his logistics company the exact same way a corrupt contractor builds a cheap, dangerous high-rise. He used substandard materials. He exploited desperate labor, forcing his drivers to work brutal, illegal hours to meet impossible corporate deadlines. He completely ignored basic safety protocols and vehicle maintenance schedules just to maximize his quarterly profit margins. He cut every conceivable corner to construct a towering illusion of massive wealth. But an illusion cannot bear real weight. I knew his corporate structure was already fracturing from the inside out under the crushing pressure of his own arrogance. Now it was time for me to step in and apply the precise amount of targeted pressure needed to bring his entire rotten edifice crashing to the ground. I did not just want to retrieve the $440,000 they had attempted to steal from my personal savings. That money was merely my visible liquid cash. It was the superficial bait they had so eagerly swallowed. What my arrogant children completely failed to understand was that a man who spends 40 years engineering city skylines does not leave his true wealth sitting in a standard neighborhood checking account. I had spent decades quietly feeding massive, untouched investment portfolios. I lived a simple, quiet life so my resources could grow exponentially in the dark. I possessed financial leverage that Cameron could not even begin to fathom. I called Lawrence Beck and instructed him to shift our strategy from defense to a highly aggressive offense. We were no longer simply freezing stolen assets and waiting for the authorities to act. We were going to initiate a hostile corporate takeover. Lawrence moved through the financial markets with the silent, lethal grace of an apex predator. He utilized my pristine investment capital to begin buying up the commercial debt of Cameron's failing logistics company. Cameron owed millions to various private lenders and equipment leasing firms and commercial real estate investment groups. His entire fleet of transport trucks and his massive distribution warehouses were leveraged to the absolute limit. Those lenders were already extremely nervous about his missed payments and his plummeting revenue streams. Lawrence approached them one by one, hiding our identity behind a freshly registered blind trust. He offered to buy Cameron's outstanding debt at a slight premium, allowing the nervous lenders to wash their hands of a toxic liability. They were absolutely thrilled to offload the risk. Within 72 hours, Lawrence had systematically purchased the promissory notes, the heavy equipment leases, and the primary warehouse mortgages. I sat in my leather armchair listening to Lawrence confirm the final transactions over a secure phone line. A deep, dark satisfaction settled into my bones. I had successfully orchestrated a total financial encirclement. I was no longer merely Cameron's elderly father sitting helplessly in the living room, waiting to be thrown into a nursing home. I was now his primary commercial creditor. I literally owned the asphalt his trucks parked on. I owned the diesel engines under their hoods. With a single phone call, I could instantly demand the massive balloon payments, force a total corporate liquidation, and completely bankrupt him. I held his entire pathetic empire in the palm of my swollen arthritic hand, and he was completely oblivious to the shadow looming over his head. He thought he was playing a brilliant game of chess while I was quietly buying the entire board right out from under him. The mechanics of the acquisition were breathtaking in their efficiency. Lawrence explained that Cameron had secured his original business loans using wildly inflated revenue projections. When the reality of his terrible management skills caught up with him, he began taking out predatory short-term loans just to cover his basic payroll and fuel costs. He was borrowing money to pay borrowed money, creating a towering house of cards. By acquiring the primary debt, I possessed the legal right to audit his operational facilities and seize his physical assets the moment he missed his next scheduled payment. I knew he would miss that payment because Lawrence had already frozen his stolen escape funds. Cameron was a man drowning in the middle of the ocean, and I had just purchased the only life raft in sight. I had absolutely no intention of throwing it to him. The heavy front door opened, and Jared walked into the living room carrying his heavy laptop case. He looked physically exhausted, but his eyes burned with a sharp electric intensity. He had spent the last 3 days relentlessly tearing through the internal digital ledgers of Cameron's logistics company. While Lawrence was busy buying up the external commercial debt, Jared was conducting a brutal forensic autopsy on the inside. He sat down on the sofa across from me and opened his computer. He did not speak right away. He simply turned the glowing screen toward me and pointed to a highly encrypted spreadsheet hidden deep within the administrative payroll directories. It was a phantom ledger completely separated from the official corporate tax filings and standard accounting software. Jared explained his findings in a low, steady voice. He had tracked a series of highly sophisticated microtransactions, draining directly from the logistics company's operational funds. Thousands of dollars were being quietly siphoned off every single week, disguised as phantom vendor payments and grossly inflated vehicle maintenance costs. The stolen money was being washed through a fake consulting firm and deposited directly into a secure, untraceable offshore account. At first, Jared assumed Cameron was simply embezzling from his own failing company to hide cash from his aggressive corporate creditors. It was a common tactic for desperate failing businessmen. But the digital footprint did not match Cameron's usual sloppy, arrogant style. The routing protocols were far too elegant and far too meticulous. Jared leaned closer to the screen, tracing the flow of the stolen capital. He detailed how the fake invoices were being generated through an automated billing system that submitted requests just under the threshold that would require secondary executive approval. Whoever set up the system understood the exact blind spots in Cameron's accounting department. They knew exactly how much blood they could drain from the corporate body without triggering a fatal alarm. Jared spent hours cross-referencing the banking IP addresses with the login times of the phantom vendor accounts. He worked backward through the digital maze, pulling apart the layers of deception until he found the source. Jared pulled up the final destination of the stolen funds, bypassing layers of basic security to reveal the ultimate beneficiary of the offshore account. I stared at the name glowing on the bright digital screen, and a cold, involuntary laugh escaped my lips. It was not Cameron. The secret account belonged entirely to Natalie. While my son was desperately trying to steal my house and my savings to rescue his sinking corporate ship, his own sister was quietly drilling massive holes in the bottom of his boat. She was systematically robbing his business, blind, siphoning his last remaining cash reserves to fund her own private luxury escape. She had fully intended to take my stolen estate and the remnants of his company and vanish completely, leaving her brother to face the federal authorities and the furious creditors completely alone. The sheer sociopathic brilliance of her betrayal was almost impressive. She had sat in my living room holding my hand and crying fake tears of concern about my supposed dementia, while simultaneously plotting to destroy her own brother. She used his arrogance and his financial desperation as a smokescreen for her own massive theft. She let Cameron take all the risks. She let Cameron forge the documents and bully the doctors and arrange the fraudulent real estate appraisals. She positioned him as the primary target for any future legal fallout while she quietly packed her bags with his money. I looked at the digital ledger and felt the final lingering shred of paternal obligation wither and die. I had spent my entire life trying to protect them and teach them the value of hard work and honest labor. They had absorbed absolutely nothing. They were parasites feeding off each other in the dark. I closed my eyes and pictured the total structural failure I was about to unleash upon them. I was going to let them realize their mutual betrayal at the exact moment their world collapsed. The thieves were actively robbing each other, completely unaware that I was watching their mutual destruction under the blinding glare of the spotlight. I had watched my children build a fortress of lies over the past few weeks, but I knew the mortar holding their bricks together was nothing more than mutual greed. Greed is a highly volatile adhesive. It bonds people together perfectly when the profit margins are expanding and the victims are compliant. But the moment the resources begin to dry up, that same greed turns instantly corrosive. Jared had handed me the digital proof of Natalie's quiet embezzlement. She was draining Cameron's logistics company dry, transferring thousands of dollars into hidden offshore accounts to fund her own private escape. I did not need to invent a weapon to destroy their alliance. I simply needed to hand them the weapons they had already forged against each other. Early Wednesday morning, I sat at my mahogany desk and printed a hard copy of Natalie's offshore banking ledger. I watched the ink glide across the crisp white pages documenting every stolen dollar and every fake vendor invoice. I placed the pages into a standard manila envelope. I did not include a note. A note provides a target for their anger. It gives them an enemy to unite against. Raw, unexplained data provides pure, unfiltered paranoia. I paid a local courier in cash to drop the envelope directly onto the reception desk at Cameron's corporate headquarters. I instructed the courier to specify that the package was highly confidential and required Cameron's immediate personal attention. I sat by the window in my study, watching the morning traffic roll past my driveway. I thought about the sheer absolute predictability of my children. They had always possessed a cannibalistic instinct toward one another. When they were in high school, they both entered the regional science fair. Cameron had spent 3 grueling weeks building a complex motorized engine block in the garage. Natalie had designed an intricate botanical terrarium using imported soil and fragile orchids. 2 days before the exhibition, I woke up in the middle of the night to find Cameron pouring industrial bleach directly into Natalie's soil. The very next afternoon, Cameron discovered that someone had completely severed the primary electrical wires inside his engine housing, rendering it a useless block of metal. They did not confront each other. They simply stood in the kitchen offering fake sympathies while secretly reveling in the destruction of their rival. My late wife Diane had wept over their behavior, unable to understand how 2 children raised in the same loving home could be so utterly devoid of empathy. I had not wept. I had simply recognized the structural flaw in their character. They would rather see the entire family fail than watch the other sibling succeed. That childhood toxicity had merely matured over the decades. It had evolved from ruined science projects into grand larceny and elder abuse. While Cameron was sitting in his failing office opening the manila envelope, Jared was executing the second phase of the operation. He drove to the upscale coffee shop downtown, where Natalie spent her late mornings pretending to work on her expensive laptop. Jared approached her table with the casual, exhausted demeanor of a man who had accidentally stumbled upon a massive, dangerous secret. He ordered a black coffee and leaned down to speak with her. He played the role of the sympathetic outsider caught in the crossfire of a family dispute. He told Natalie that he had overheard Cameron making frantic phone calls to international banking regulators late last night. He fed her a brilliant, terrifying lie. He told her Cameron was actively liquidating his remaining corporate assets and securing a one-way flight to a country with 0 extradition treaties. He suggested that Cameron was planning to leave the entire family behind to face the legal fallout of the forged house sale while he vanished with the cash. Natalie maintained a frozen, polite smile, but Jared later told me the color completely drained from her face. Her perfectly manicured fingers began to tremble against the edge of her coffee cup. Her eyes darted wildly around the room as her mind raced to process the implications. She had firmly believed she was the only one holding a secret parachute. The sudden realization that her brother might actually abandon her on the sinking ship shattered her fragile composure entirely. By 2 o'clock in the afternoon, the trap violently snapped shut. Jared sat at my dining room table monitoring the cloned digital signals from their cell phones. The text messages between my children began to populate on Jared's computer screen in real time. At first, the messages were simply tense and accusatory. Cameron demanded to know why $50,000 was missing from his corporate payroll account. He asked her if she had authorized any external vendor transfers without his signature. Natalie immediately deflected the accusation. She attacked him instead, accusing him of trying to hoard the upcoming real estate money for a solo escape to South America. I stood behind Jared, looking over his shoulder as the blue and gray text bubbles multiplied. It was a masterclass in psychological self-destruction. I had spent decades engineering structures to withstand massive external pressure, but my children were collapsing under the weight of their own internal corruption. They lacked discipline. They lacked the cold patience required to execute a complex strategy. They were driven entirely by impulse and fear. Cameron typed paragraph after paragraph of furious manic threats. His grammar deteriorated as his panic escalated. He accused Natalie of plotting to leave him holding the bag for the forged deed. He demanded she transfer the stolen funds back into the corporate account immediately, or he would lock her out of the real estate closing entirely. Natalie responded with single sharp sentences designed to inflict maximum psychological damage. She mocked his failing business. She mocked his inability to secure a legitimate bank loan. She told him he was a sinking ship, and she absolutely refused to drown with him. Within 20 minutes, the digital exchange degraded into a vicious, bloodthirsty war. They abandoned all pretense of familial loyalty. They threatened to expose each other to the federal authorities. Cameron promised to hand over the digital records of her embezzlement to the district attorney. Natalie promised to hand over the fraudulent psychiatric evaluations and the forged notary documents directly to the police. They were actively tearing each other to pieces. They were burning their entire criminal alliance to ash over a digital server, while Jared and I watched the smoke rise from the comfort of my home. It was a spectacular implosion. Every cruel word they typed was a testament to their profound moral bankruptcy. They were so consumed by their mutual hatred and paranoia that they completely failed to question the origin of the envelope or the convenient timing of Jared's coffee shop whisper. They simply reacted with the blind, vicious instinct of cornered animals fighting over a scrap of meat. I poured myself a glass of cold water and drank it slowly, watching the final insults populate on the glowing screen. The sun began to set, casting long, dark shadows across the living room floor. The house was perfectly quiet, but the digital war raging on the table was deafening. Yet despite the pure venom flowing between them, the gravitational pull of my supposed wealth was simply too strong to break their orbit completely. They were addicts, and the massive cash payout was their ultimate fix. Tomorrow was Thursday. It was the absolute final deadline for the private cash closing on my estate. They both knew that if they failed to appear at the title office together, the buyer would walk away and the massive payout would vanish forever. Jared watched the final text messages scroll across the screen late that night. The aggressive threats slowly morphed into bitter, reluctant compromises. Cameron and Natalie agreed to a cold, temporary truce. They promised to stand side by side just long enough to sign the final transfer papers and collect the wire transfer before going their separate ways forever. They explicitly agreed to split the money right down the middle and never speak to each other again. They truly believed they could hold their mutual hatred in check for one more morning. They believed their combined greed would be strong enough to carry them across the finish line. They prepared to wake up the next morning and walk into the title office completely blind. They were so focused on watching each other's hands that they remained entirely unaware of the federal ambush waiting patiently behind the doors. The conference room at the downtown title agency was a masterpiece of sterile intimidation. The walls were painted a lifeless slate gray, and the massive rectangular table in the center of the room was carved from cold, polished marble. It was a space specifically designed for the quiet, clinical transfer of massive sums of money. The overhead fluorescent lights hummed with a low synthetic buzz, casting harsh shadows across the faces of the people sitting around the table. Cameron sat on the edge of his heavy leather chair, his right leg bouncing with a frantic, rhythmic, nervous energy. He wore a sharp navy blue suit, but the collar of his shirt was already damp with anxious sweat. Natalie sat directly across from him, maintaining a rigid, statuesque posture. She wore an expensive beige cashmere sweater and kept her hands perfectly folded over her designer handbag. They were both staring hungrily at the thick stack of closing documents resting in the exact center of the marble table. Sitting at the far end of the table was the private cash investor. He was an older man with slicked-back silver hair and a predatory smile who specialized in purchasing distressed residential properties at a fraction of their actual market value. He had brought a certified cashier's check for the exact agreed-upon amount. The title agent, a young woman with nervous eyes and a stack of colorful sticky notes, was methodically flipping through the pages, placing a bright blue tag next to every signature line. The finish line was merely inches away. Cameron and Natalie only needed to apply their fraudulent power of attorney signatures to finalize the complete theft of my physical estate and walk away with their stolen wealth. They never even made it to the first dotted line. The heavy mahogany door of the conference room did not just open. It swung inward with a violent, forceful momentum that slammed the brass handle hard against the drywall. The loud physical impact echoed through the sterile room like a sudden detonation. Everyone at the marble table physically jumped in their seats. I stepped across the threshold and walked directly into the center of the room. I did not shuffle. I did not drag my feet. I did not lean on the polished wooden cane that I had deliberately left resting against the wall in my own hallway. I stood perfectly straight, expanding my chest and squaring my shoulders. I carried the exact same commanding physical authority that I used for 40 years when walking onto a chaotic, dangerous construction site to discipline a failing crew. The fragile, trembling old man they had so viciously mocked and manipulated was completely gone. I was the master structural engineer, and I had come to supervise the final demolition of their pathetic criminal enterprise. I was not alone. Jared stepped through the doorway immediately to my left, holding a thick, expanding file folder packed with the digital evidence of their embezzlement and internal corporate sabotage. Lawrence Beck stepped in smoothly to my right, looking immaculate and terrifying in a tailored charcoal suit. We formed a solid, impenetrable human wall just inside the conference room. The color drained out of Natalie's face so rapidly, it looked as though she had been physically struck. Her perfect manufactured composure shattered into a million jagged pieces. She gripped the edge of the marble table so tightly, her knuckles turned a ghostly, translucent white. Her eyes darted wildly between my steady, unblinking gaze and the thick file folder resting in Jared's hands. She knew instantly that the quiet shadow war was over, and the harsh, blinding light of consequence had finally arrived. Cameron, however, simply could not process the visual data in front of his eyes. His brain fundamentally rejected the reality of my sudden physical strength. He fell back on his default defensive mechanism. He immediately tried to reinstate the false narrative of my failing mind. He stood up from his leather chair, pushing his hands out in front of him in a gesture of exaggerated theatrical concern. He plastered a sickly, sweet, patronizing smile across his sweating face. He spoke in a loud, slow voice, specifically projecting his words so the title agent and the cash buyer would hear him. He asked me what on earth I was doing out of bed. He told me I was supposed to be resting at home under strict medical supervision. He turned to the title agent and offered a fake, apologetic laugh, claiming that my dementia was causing me to wander and that I was currently experiencing a severe, confused episode. He took a step toward me, reaching his hand out as if to gently guide a lost child back into the hallway. He was desperate to maintain the illusion, playing the role of the devoted son, sacrificing his own time to manage his poor, decaying father. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice. I did not even grant my son the basic dignity of looking at his face. I treated him as if he were completely invisible. I treated him as if he were nothing more than a minor atmospheric disturbance in the room. I let his hand hover awkwardly in the empty space between us, completely ignored. I turned my attention entirely to the young title agent sitting at the table. I locked my eyes directly onto hers. I spoke in a voice that was deep, resonant, and absolutely commanding. I stated my full legal name. I recited the exact address of my property. I pointed a steady, unwavering finger directly at the stack of closing documents resting under her hands. I informed her in a tone that brokered absolutely no argument that I was the sole legal owner of that real estate. I declared formally and clearly for the entire room to hear that I had never authorized the sale of my home. I told her that the power of attorney documents submitted by the two people sitting across from her were entirely fraudulent, and that the signature they had provided was a deliberate criminal forgery. The title agent's eyes went wide with sudden, absolute panic. She snatched her hands away from the stack of papers as if the documents had suddenly caught fire. She looked at Cameron and then back at me, completely paralyzed by the sheer gravity of my accusation. The entire atmosphere of the room inverted in a fraction of a second. It was no longer a profitable corporate closing. It was an active crime scene. The private cash buyer sitting at the far end of the marble table was a man who survived by understanding financial risk. He instantly recognized that the situation had just turned incredibly toxic and highly radioactive. He wanted absolutely nothing to do with a contested deed or a massive federal fraud investigation. He stood up abruptly, shoving his expensive leather chair backwards so hard it crashed into the slate-gray wall behind him. He reached across the table and snatched his certified cashier's check, stuffing it deeply into the inside pocket of his suit jacket. He did not say a single word of farewell to Cameron or Natalie. He simply grabbed his briefcase and moved rapidly toward the conference room exit, desperate to flee the building and escape the blast radius of their collapsing scheme. He did not make it out of the room. As the buyer rushed toward the doorway, Lawrence Beck stepped squarely into the center of his path. Lawrence did not move aggressively, but his physical placement was an absolute unyielding barricade. The buyer stopped short, letting out an angry, confused breath, demanding that Lawrence get out of his way immediately. Lawrence did not move a single inch. He maintained a perfectly calm, terrifyingly polite expression. He reached a slow, deliberate hand into the breast pocket of his tailored charcoal suit jacket. He retrieved a thick, folded piece of heavy legal paper. He unrolled the document with a sharp, crisp snap of his wrists and pressed it flat against the center of the buyer's chest. Lawrence spoke in a voice smooth as glass, but sharp as a razor blade. He informed the sweating investor that he was officially serving him with a federal subpoena for active participation in a conspiracy to commit real estate fraud. Lawrence advised him that federal financial regulators had already flagged the attempted transaction and that his physical presence would be required at a sworn deposition by the end of the week. The cash buyer looked down at the federal seal printed on the paper, and his face contorted in absolute unadulterated horror. The final exit door had just been slammed shut and locked from the outside. The trap was completely sealed. The heavy mahogany door was still vibrating on its hinges from the cash buyer's desperate attempt to escape the room. The federal subpoena rested like a lead weight against his chest as Lawrence Beck blocked his path with absolute, unyielding authority. The sterile fluorescent lights of the title office illuminated a scene of total and absolute devastation. The quiet, clinical transfer of massive wealth had been violently derailed. Natalie stared at the space where her perfect, highly lucrative future had just evaporated into thin air. Her gaze shifted slowly from the terrified buyer trapped near the doorway to my face, and finally settled on the man standing quietly by my right side. She looked at Jared. She looked at the husband she had treated as a compliant piece of background furniture for the entirety of their marriage. Natalie's chest heaved as her breathing turned shallow and erratic. The initial shock, paralyzing her nervous system, rapidly transmuted into a vicious, unhinged fury. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger directly at Jared, and her voice shattered the tense, heavy silence of the conference room. She screamed at him, demanding to know what he was doing, standing next to me. She called him a traitor and a pathetic coward who had deliberately sabotaged his own wife's financial security. She practically spit the words across the polished marble table, accusing him of destroying their family for the sake of a broken, senile old man. She demanded that he cross the room and stand by her side where a loyal husband belonged. Jared did not raise his voice. He did not flinch under her venomous verbal assault. He stepped forward with a glacial, calculated calmness that seemed to absorb all the remaining oxygen in the room. He reached into his leather messenger bag and retrieved a thick manila folder. He tossed it onto the center of the table, right on top of the fraudulent property deeds they had tried to force me to sign just minutes before. The heavy thud of the paper hitting the solid marble echoed like a judge's gavel signaling the end of the trial. Jared looked at his wife with eyes completely devoid of any remaining affection. He told Natalie that she had a deeply flawed understanding of the word loyalty. He instructed Cameron to open the folder. Cameron, whose mind was still spinning wildly from the federal trap, looked down at the documents with deep suspicion. Jared did not wait for my son to read the printed pages. He began reciting the contents from memory with surgical, relentless precision. He detailed the exact routing numbers of the offshore banking accounts Natalie had secretly opened in the Cayman Islands. He explained step by step how she had been systematically embezzling thousands of dollars from Cameron's failing logistics company over the past 8 months. Cameron snapped his head toward his sister, his eyes wide with a horrifying realization. The money he had been bleeding, the missing payroll funds, the desperate short-term loans he had taken out with predatory lenders just to keep his delivery trucks running. It was all because his own sister had been quietly bleeding his corporate accounts dry from the inside. She had been stealing the foundation out from under his business to fund her own private luxury escape. Natalie tried to interrupt, stammering out a frantic, disorganized denial, but her voice cracked under the weight of the undeniable proof lying right in front of them. The bank statements highlighted her guilt in stark black and white ink. Jared was not finished dismantling her life. He turned his attention back to Natalie, delivering the final, devastating blow to her pristine facade. He told her the folder also contained a secondary set of documents that had absolutely nothing to do with corporate logistics. He explained that those specific pages detailed a comprehensive, highly accurate timeline of her physical whereabouts over the last calendar year. He mentioned a specific luxury boutique hotel across town and clearly stated the name of a man she had been seeing every Tuesday and Thursday afternoon. The color completely vanished from Natalie's face. She stood absolutely frozen, her mouth opening and closing without producing a single coherent sound. Jared kept his voice low and incredibly steady, a terrifying contrast to her previous hysterical screaming. He told her he had known about the affair for exactly 12 months. He had discovered the hotel receipts in the glove compartment of her car long before this chaotic real estate scheme even began to take shape. Natalie finally found a desperate breath and asked him why he had stayed silent, why he had continued to sleep in the same bed and eat at the same dining table if he knew she was betraying him so intimately. Jared looked at me for a brief second before returning his cold, unblinking gaze to his wife. He told her that he stayed silent because he saw the early warning signs of what she and Cameron were planning to do to me. He knew that if he confronted her about the infidelity, she would immediately file for a rapid divorce and sever his access to her personal devices and financial networks. He chose to swallow his pride and endure the daily psychological humiliation of a broken marriage so he could secretly monitor her digital communications. He sacrificed his own dignity to gather the concrete evidence required to protect the only man who had ever treated him like a real son. He chose absolute loyalty to a father figure over the toxic, rotting illusion of his marriage. Jared tapped the top of the manila folder with his index finger. He informed Natalie that the final document in that stack was a formal petition for divorce citing egregious marital misconduct and severe financial fraud. He told her he had filed it with the county court clerk that very morning. He told her she was walking out of this building with absolutely nothing. She had no house. She had no offshore cash. She had no husband. and she had a looming federal investigation staring her directly in the face. The young title agent sitting at the edge of the table was completely paralyzed, pressing herself back into her rolling chair to avoid the blast radius of this total family collapse. The sterile walls of the office offered no sanctuary from the raw, unvarnished exposure of their crimes. Natalie slumped backward into her heavy leather chair, burying her face in her trembling hands. The immaculate image she had spent a lifetime cultivating was permanently obliterated. She was exposed as a thief, a liar, and a traitor to her own blood. Cameron stared at his sister, a dark, dangerous shadow washing over his face. He realized he was standing in the center of a burning building, and Natalie was the one holding the empty gasoline can. His logistics company was dead. The federal regulators were already auditing his shell corporations. The cash buyer had fled the room to save himself. He had absolutely nothing left to lose, and nowhere left to run. His panic boiled over into a blind, violent rage, but he did not direct his fury at Natalie, who had stolen his money. He directed it at the man who had exposed the entire rotten foundation of his life. He directed it at Jared. Cameron let out a guttural sound that was less human and more like the roar of a cornered predator. He kicked his heavy leather chair backward so violently it crashed into the wall and tipped over. He planted his hands on the polished marble table and vaulted his body directly across the wide surface. His eyes were locked onto Jared's throat. His hands curled into tight, white-knuckled fists. He was launching a desperate physical assault, intending to destroy the man who had engineered his total humiliation. I did not wait for Cameron to cross the distance. I stepped directly into his path, placing my physical body squarely between my son and Jared. I drew in a deep breath, filling my lungs with an authority forged over decades of commanding men in highly dangerous situations. I did not raise my hands to fight him. I simply unleashed a single word. I yelled his name. The sound cracked through the sterile air of the conference room like a heavy leather whip. It was a voice he had not heard since he was a terrified child caught breaking the rules. It was a sound that carried the absolute undeniable weight of a father who still controlled the ground his son walked upon. Cameron froze in midair, hovering awkwardly over the marble table, completely paralyzed by the sheer concussive force of my command. The echo of my voice hung in the sterile air of the title office like a physical weight. Cameron stood frozen over the marble table, completely paralyzed by a command he had not heard since he was a frightened boy. His fists slowly uncurled. The violent, manic energy drained from his posture, leaving behind nothing but a hollow, trembling shell. He sank slowly back into his leather chair, unable to pull his eyes away from mine. The absolute silence in the room was suffocating. Natalie sat beside him, resembling a shattered porcelain doll. Her manicured hands were pressed white over her mouth, as the reality of her total exposure finally crushed the breath from her lungs. Lawrence Beck stepped forward and smoothly assumed absolute command of the room. He moved with the calm, terrifying efficiency of a surgeon preparing to amputate a necrotic limb. He placed his fine leather briefcase on the polished marble and clicked the brass locks open. The sound was deafening in the quiet space. He retrieved a thick stack of federal financial documents and laid them out in a perfectly neat row. He looked at my children with an expression of pure clinical detachment. He told them they were no longer dealing with a simple family dispute over a piece of real estate. They had officially crossed the threshold into federal conspiracy. Lawrence picked up a copy of the fraudulent deed transfer. He pointed a steady finger at the signature I had scrawled at the bottom of the page the previous night. He explained the mechanics of the trap in a slow, deliberate voice, ensuring every single word penetrated their panic. He told them the name signed on that document did not exist in any civilian registry. He revealed it was a classified government alias I had utilized during a deep-cover engineering contract in the 1980s. The identity was legally voided decades ago. He explained that the moment the corrupt notary attempted to process the paperwork, the federal database automatically cross-referenced the signature with my actual Social Security number. The resulting mismatch instantly flagged the transaction as a high-priority felony. They had not secured a piece of property. They had successfully handed the federal government a perfectly documented confession of attempted real estate fraud and identity theft. Natalie let out a raw, choking gasp. She looked at the papers as if they were soaked in poison. But Lawrence was far from finished. He turned his cold gaze directly toward her. He informed her that the federal alert had initiated an immediate cascade effect across all our monitored financial networks. He told her the authorities had traced the sudden massive withdrawal attempt Cameron made the night before. They had tracked the $440,000 right to the digital firewall. Lawrence smiled a thin, humorless smile. He told them the money was no longer simply frozen in a domestic holding account. Because Cameron had attempted to wire those stolen funds to an untraceable offshore account, the federal regulators had officially classified the action as international wire fraud. The government had completely seized the assets. The money was gone. Every single penny they had plotted to steal was now locked inside a federal evidence vault, and they would never see a dime of it again. The magnitude of the loss struck Natalie with physical force. Her secret escape fund, her golden parachute out of her miserable life, had just evaporated into the sterile air. She slumped forward, resting her forehead against the cool marble table, completely defeated. Cameron stared at the documents with wide, unblinking eyes. His breathing was ragged and shallow. He tried to form a sentence, but his vocal cords refused to cooperate. He looked at Lawrence and then looked at me silently, pleading for some kind of sudden, miraculous reprieve. He truly believed that losing the house and losing the cash was the absolute bottom of his nightmare. He was entirely mistaken. Lawrence reached into his briefcase one final time. He produced a single heavy sheet of premium cardstock. He slid it across the smooth marble surface until it bumped gently against Cameron's trembling hands. Lawrence instructed him to read the header. It was an official notice of default. Cameron stared at the paper, his mind completely failing to process the implications. He looked up at me, his face pale and slick with nervous sweat. He asked me what this was, whispering the words as if he were afraid of the answer. I stepped closer to the table, towering over my broken son. I kept my voice low and terrifyingly calm. I told Cameron that I did not just want my money back. I told him I wanted absolute total leverage over the people who had tried to throw me into a cage. I explained that while he was busy forging medical proxies and hiring corrupt notaries, I was utilizing my untouched investment portfolios. I told him I had spent the last 72 hours anonymously purchasing the commercial debt of his failing logistics company. I detailed the promissory notes, the heavy equipment leases, and the primary warehouse mortgages that Lawrence had acquired on my behalf. I leaned down, placing both of my hands flat on the table. I looked directly into his terrified eyes. I told him that I was now his primary commercial creditor. I owned the trucks he used to exploit his workers. I owned the warehouses where he cut his safety corners. I owned every single piece of asphalt and concrete associated with his pathetic, crumbling empire. I informed him that the notice of default sitting in front of him was effective immediately due to his fraudulent banking activity and his seized assets. I told him I was calling in the massive balloon payments in full today. Because he could not pay, I was initiating an immediate hostile liquidation. His company was completely and irrevocably dead. I was tearing his business down to the studs, selling off the scrap metal, and burying his corporate legacy in the dirt. Cameron buried his face in his hands, letting out a loud, agonizing groan. He was a man completely stripped of his armor. He had no money, no business, no allies, and no escape. I looked at the two of them sitting there in the wreckage of their own spectacular greed. A profound, heavy sorrow washed over the cold satisfaction in my chest. I thought of my late wife, Diane. I thought of the countless hours she had spent trying to instill basic human empathy into these two selfish creatures. I spoke her name into the quiet room. I told them that their mother would have been absolutely heartbroken to see them sitting at this table today. I told them she would have wept for the hollow, treacherous adults they had chosen to become. But I also reminded them of a lesson Diane had taught me during the hardest years of our lives. I told them she taught me that a structural foundation cannot survive if it is riddled with termites. She taught me to never negotiate with parasites. I told them I was cutting the rot out of my life today to honor her memory. I was preserving the house she loved by excising the people who sought to defile it. They had no arguments left. They had no lies left to spin. They were completely surrounded by the suffocating realities of their own actions. The silence that followed my words was heavy and final. We simply stood there, watching the devastating consequences finally settle into their bones. Then the atmosphere in the room shifted again. A strange, pulsing rhythm began to reflect against the frosted glass of the conference room windows. Bright alternating flashes of intense red and vivid blue light pierced the dull gray shadows of the office. The colors washed across the marble table, illuminating the pale, terrified faces of my children. We heard the heavy, distinct sound of vehicle doors slamming shut in the parking lot outside. We heard the authoritative crunch of heavy boots marching rapidly up the concrete steps toward the main entrance. The federal ambush had arrived right on schedule. The trap had not just sprung, it had permanently locked them inside. The red and blue lights pulsing against the frosted glass of the title office windows shattered the final remaining illusion of their control. The heavy rhythmic sound of boots echoing down the exterior hallway signaled the absolute end of their criminal enterprise. Cameron completely collapsed. He did not simply sit down in his leather chair. His legs completely gave out beneath him, and he fell hard onto his knees right there on the sterile linoleum floor. He crawled forward like a pathetic wounded animal and grabbed the sharp crease of my trousers. He looked up at me with hot tears streaming down his flushed face and began desperately begging for mercy. He promised to return every single cent of the money he had attempted to steal from my personal accounts. He swore he would sign the failing logistics company over to me without a single legal fight. He pleaded with me to call off Lawrence Beck and the federal authorities waiting just outside the heavy door. He told me he was my son and that I could not possibly send my own flesh and blood to a brutal federal prison. His voice was a loud, desperate whine echoing miserably through the silent room. He offered me a lifetime of absolute obedience if I would just make the police turn around and go away. Natalie chose an entirely different tactic. She completely abandoned the vicious fury she had directed at Jared only moments earlier. She instantly slipped back into the role of the devoted, terrified daughter. She forced heavy tears to well up in her eyes, and her chin trembled with practiced theatrical precision. She reached her perfectly manicured hands out toward me, pleading for understanding and compassion. She told me she had only stolen from Cameron's company because he was a reckless, arrogant fool who was going to bankrupt the entire family anyway. She claimed she was secretly trying to protect my financial legacy by hiding the cash in those offshore accounts. She wept openly and begged me to remember how much she loved me and how much my late wife Diane had loved her. She tried to play upon the fundamental biological instinct of a father to protect his little girl from harm. She spoke of our family history and the holidays we used to share, attempting to use my own precious memories as a shield against her impending incarceration. I looked down at the two of them writhing and pleading on the floor of the title office. I felt absolutely zero emotion. There was no anger left in my heart. There was no pity, and there was certainly no hesitation. There was only the cold, hard clarity of a man inspecting a condemned building right before the wrecking ball takes its first swing. I looked directly into Natalie's weeping eyes and told her to stop the pathetic performance immediately. I told her that invoking her mother's name to justify her own repulsive greed was the final, unforgivable insult. I told them both exactly how their own towering arrogance had completely blinded them to the truth. They genuinely believed my physical age equated to mental decay. They assumed my quiet demeanor meant I was ignorant to their plotting. They were so utterly consumed by their own massive greed that they failed to realize they were dealing with a man who had spent 40 long years calculating load-bearing structures and anticipating catastrophic failures. They thought they were the brilliant architects of a flawless master plan, but they were nothing more than predictable common parasites feeding on a foundation they could never truly understand or replicate. I looked at Cameron kneeling on the floor, and then at Natalie shrinking back into her heavy leather chair. I realized with absolute crystal clarity that the children I had raised were permanently gone. They had not died today in this sterile office. They had died the exact moment they chose greed over their own blood. The people crying in front of me were merely dangerous strangers wearing the familiar faces of my past. The heavy mahogany door swung completely open, and two uniformed police officers stepped into the room, followed closely by a stern federal investigator in a dark suit. They did not ask any questions. They did not hesitate or wait for an explanation. Lawrence Beck had already provided them with a meticulous ironclad portfolio of evidence detailing the elder fraud, the international wire fraud, and the blatantly forged power of attorney documents. The officers moved efficiently and silently across the room. They pulled Cameron up from the floor, roughly twisting his arms behind his back. The sharp metallic click of the steel handcuffs locking tightly around his wrists echoed loudly off the polished marble table. Another officer grabbed Natalie's hands and secured them behind her back, completely ignoring her frantic, hysterical sobs. The federal investigator read them their rights in a dull, monotone voice, clearly listing the severe federal felony charges they were about to face. I stood perfectly still next to Jared and Lawrence, watching the police physically march my two children out of the conference room. Cameron kept looking back over his shoulder, begging me to stop them, but I simply turned my face away and stared at the blank gray wall. We walked out of the title office a few minutes later, leaving the shocked and terrified title agent sitting alone at her desk. The crisp morning air hit my face as I stepped through the glass doors, and I took a deep, expanding breath. The oppressive, toxic weight I had been carrying on my chest for months completely vanished. Jared walked quietly beside me, holding the thick manila folder containing the final remnants of his old, ruined life. He looked physically exhausted, but there was a distinct, profound relief shining in his eyes. He had sacrificed everything he knew to protect the truth, and I fully intended to reward that absolute, unyielding loyalty. By the time we reached my car in the parking lot, Lawrence Beck checked his phone and confirmed that the frozen offshore funds had been legally and securely transferred directly back into my personal control. The entire operation was a complete, flawless success. The very next morning, I sat in Lawrence Beck's upscale downtown office and legally dismantled every single piece of my previous will. I completely removed Cameron and Natalie from every document, erasing their names from my legacy forever. I transferred the vast majority of my entire substantial estate into a newly formed charitable foundation. The foundation was dedicated strictly to providing full educational scholarships for underprivileged students studying advanced structural engineering. I wanted my wealth to build strong, reliable futures, not fuel the destruction of greedy parasites. For Jared, I established a massive, irrevocable financial trust. I ensured with airtight legal protections that he would never have to worry about a single financial burden or housing cost for the rest of his natural life. He had proven himself to be the only true, honorable family I had left in this world. Later that evening, I stood on the wooden porch of my home. The beautiful property they had tried so desperately to steal from under my feet was still firmly mine. The sun was slowly setting below the distant tree line, casting a brilliant, warm, golden light across the freshly manicured lawn. A gentle evening breeze moved through the heavy branches of the old oak tree standing in the front yard. I was entirely alone inside the large, sprawling house. There were no deceitful children pretending to care for my failing health. There were no frantic, panicked phone calls echoing from the kitchen. There were no hushed, venomous whispers in the hallway plotting my rapid destruction. I watched the shadows stretch across the grass and felt the solid wooden planks of the porch supporting my weight. I had engineered a final beautiful victory from the ashes of their deceit. There was only a deep, profound, beautiful silence settling over the property. For a brief, fleeting moment, I thought the silence might feel heavy or sad after a lifetime of raising a family. But as I watched the final glowing rays of the sun disappear completely over the horizon, I realized the beautiful truth. The silence in the house was no longer a heavy burden to bear. It was the pure, undeniable sound of absolute, unshakable peace. The events that transpired in that sterile title office serve as a profound testament to the destructive nature of unchecked greed. When individuals prioritize financial accumulation over basic human decency, they inevitably construct a fragile reality built entirely on deception. This story demonstrates that true loyalty is not defined by bloodlines or legal contracts, but by the quiet, consistent choices we make to protect those who have earned our trust. Jared's sacrifice highlights the immense personal cost of doing the right thing in the face of profound betrayal. Ultimately, the narrative proves that manipulative schemes, however meticulously planned, will always shatter under the weight of undeniable truth and unwavering moral resolve. Share your thoughts on Jared's ultimate sacrifice in the comments section below, and subscribe for more stories of justice and retribution.